Welcome to another thrilling historical Western romance audiobook, Sheriff's Secret. If you are new to our channel, we invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our daily releases of captivating historical Western romance stories. And if you enjoy our content, don't forget to leave a like to show your support. For our loyal listeners, welcome back. Excited to have you here again. Shall we begin? Act 1. The dawn sun bled across the sky in fiery streaks, chasing away the cool grip of night. A dry wind stirred up the dust along Redemption's empty main street, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant rain. Sheriff Cole McAllister guided his horse at a slow, deliberate pace, his sharp gaze sweeping over the town he had sworn to protect. Even in the hush of morning, the weight of old sins pressed against his chest. War had a way of marking a man, carving out the good and leaving behind something raw and jagged. Redemption might have granted him a badge, but it hadn't erased the ghosts. His horse, a sturdy black gelding, snorted and flicked its ears as they passed the Wilson homestead on the outskirts of town. A woman in a patched gingham dress stood on the porch, her hands dusted with flour as she waved. Cole tipped his hat in return. Behind her, a young boy peered out, wide-eyed. He knew that look. Admiration, edged with the kind of curiosity that meant the boy had heard the stories. The sheriff who'd once ridden with outlaws, the war hero with blood on his hands. Cole forced down the old bitterness. He had made his choice to leave behind the battlefield and the shadows of his past. But some ghosts refused to stay buried. The town stirred awake as he continued his patrol. The blacksmith's hammer rang against metal, the rhythmic sound breaking the silence. A woman swept the wooden porch of the mercantile, pausing to nod as he passed. Outside the saloon, a cluster of men muttered amongst themselves. The way their conversation stilled when he neared made his skin tighten beneath his duster. He was used to it. The whispers. The cautious respect laced with speculation. Some men wore their scars on their skin, his were deeper, carved into his very soul. Cole reached the sheriff's office and slid off his horse, looping the reins over the hitching post. The sun climbed higher, throwing long shadows across the dusty street. He exhaled, slow and measured, and pressed a hand to the cool metal of the badge pinned to his chest. Redemption. It was more than the name of the town. It was a promise he wasn't sure he could ever keep. The sheriff's office smelled of leather dust and old paper, familiar scents that should have been a comfort. Instead, they closed in around Cole like a noose. He sat at his desk, a stack of case files spread before him, the edges curled from use. Some were old petty thefts, drunken brawls, ranch disputes. Others were fresher, darker. A string of missing cattle, a murder that still sat unresolved, and a letter folded and creased that he hadn't been able to bring himself to throw away. The ink had faded some, but the words still carried the same weight. A name from his past, scrawled in sharp strokes. A reminder that the war hadn't buried everything he'd left behind. He exhaled and tossed it aside, rubbing at the knot of tension in his neck. The door creaked open. "Morning, Sheriff." Cole looked up as his deputy, Ben Grady, stepped inside. The younger man carried himself with easy confidence, a grin tugging at his mouth. But Cole didn't miss the way his eyes flicked first to the scattered papers, then to the discarded letter. "Grady." Cole sat back, watching. "You're early. Figured I'd get a head start. Couple of ranchers were in town last night, talking about a stranger asking too many questions. Seemed off." Ben pulled a chair up, stretching out like he hadn't a care in the world. "You think it's got something to do with that stolen livestock over at the Harper place?" "Maybe," Cole allowed, but there was something in Ben's tone too casual, too light, like he was fishing for something. Ben drummed his fingers against the arm of the chair. "Folks still talking about the war, you know." Cole's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, folding his hands together. "That's so." Ben gave a slow nod. "Not saying it means anything, just that some people don't let go of things easy." Cole studied him, his gut tightening with an instinct honed from years of reading men. Ben had always been steady, loyal, dependable, but there was an edge now. a hesitation in the way he met Cole's gaze, like he was measuring his words. Secrets had a way of festering. "I know how folks talk," Cole said evenly. "Question is, what are they saying?" Ben smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Nothing you haven't heard before." That was the thing about rumors. The ones that wouldn't die were usually rooted in truth. Cole let the silence stretch, watching the flicker of something unreadable cross Ben's face. Then, with a casual nod, the deputy stood. "I'll ride out to Harper's, see if I can't get a lead on that stolen stock." Cole nodded, but didn't move until the door shut behind him. Something was off. He'd spent too many years in the company of liars and killers not to recognize when a man was hiding something. Ben Grady was keeping secrets, and Cole had the uneasy feeling he wasn't going to like what they were. The sun hung low over the desert, bleeding streaks of gold and crimson across the sky. Dust rose in lazy swirls as a lone rider approached the town of Redemption, her silhouette a dark cutout against the dying light. Rose O'Hara tightened her grip on the reins, her fingers stiff from the long ride. Her mare, a sturdy dun with a stubborn streak, snorted as they neared the outskirts of town. She reached down, smoothing a hand over the animal's sweat-dampened neck. "Almost there, girl," she murmured. The words were soft, but her voice carried the weight of exhaustion, of miles behind her and uncertainty ahead. The town came into sharper focus as she closed in. Wooden storefronts lined the street, lanterns flickering in the gathering dusk. A few men lingered outside the saloon, their voices low and rough with whiskey. Somewhere a dog barked. She kept her posture straight, her expression unreadable, but her pulse quickened. She'd been in towns like this before, places where folks took one look at a stranger and made up their minds. She couldn't afford curiosity. Not now. Her boots were scuffed from the journey, the leather cracked in places from too many nights spent under open skies. The hem of her riding skirt was dust-streaked, and though she still held her head high, there was a weight in her eyes one only a woman on the run carried. She reached for the locket at her throat, her fingers brushing over the cool metal. The chain was thin but strong, a small silver oval nestled just beneath the hollow of her collarbone. She resisted the urge to open it, to let old memories slip free. Not now. Not when every decision she made meant the difference between safety and discovery. A gust of wind swept through the street, carrying the scent of sage and something deeper coal smoke from a distant fire. Maybe. It settled around her like an omen, but Rose squared her shoulders and pressed forward. Redemption. She hoped the name wasn't just a cruel joke. Rose dismounted outside a modest boarding house, the wooden porch slanted slightly from years of use. A single lantern burned in the window, casting a glow over the peeling paint and the rocking chair that creaked in the night breeze. She loosened the reins, tying her mare to the hitching post with steady fingers, though every nerve in her body hummed with awareness. She wasn't alone. A handful of townsfolk milled about the streetmen leaning against storefronts, boots scraping against the dirt as they whispered among themselves. She felt their eyes on her, assessing, measuring. "Newcomer," one murmured, voice carrying in the quiet dusk. "Mighty pretty one at that," another muttered, followed by a low chuckle. Rose ignored them, keeping her movements unhurried. A woman alone in a town like this had to be careful, had to balance between showing confidence and not inviting trouble. She reached for her saddlebags, pausing only when the conversation shifted. A woman ridden in alone at this hour. An older man mused from a chair outside the mercantile. "Ain't natural. Maybe she's meeting someone," another suggested. The implication hung in the air, thick and crude. Rose's fingers clenched around the leather strap, but she didn't look up. Instead, she lifted her chin and strode toward the boarding house steps, her boots thudding against the worn wood. She wasn't here to make friends. The saloon doors across the street swung open, the sounds of laughter and piano spilling out into the night. A man stepped onto the porch, leaning against the post with an ease that came from years of watching people come and go. Rose glanced up and met his eyes. The bartender. He was older, mid-40s maybe, with graying hair at his temples and a knowing gaze. Not unkind, but sharp. Too sharp. He studied her like a man used to reading people, and she knew he'd already drawn his own conclusions. A stranger. A woman alone. The way she kept glancing over her shoulder like she expected someone to be following. Rose swallowed hard and turned away, stepping through the door of the boarding house before she could let that knowing look unsettle her further. The whispers didn't stop as the door shut behind her. If anything, they grew. And deep in her gut, she knew this town wouldn't let a woman like her slip through unnoticed. The air inside the saloon was thick with the scent of whiskey sweat and the slow burn of cheap cigars. Lanterns flickered against the smoke-stained ceiling, casting long shadows over men hunched around card tables, their faces weathered from sun and hardship. The piano player struck a few lazy notes in the corner, but no one was paying him much mind. Rose stepped inside and hesitated just long enough to let her eyes adjust. The place was rough but not unexpected, no worse than other watering holes she'd passed through on her way west. She moved toward the bar, careful to keep her stride measured, her expression unreadable. A woman alone in a place like this. It was an invitation for trouble if she wasn't careful. She didn't make it 3 steps before the trouble found her. A chair scraped back too fast. Voices rose. Then came the telltale sound of knuckles connecting with flesh. The brawl erupted without warning, a violent clash of fists and flying bottles. 2 men, already too deep in their cups, went sprawling across a table, sending cards and whiskey tumbling. A third staggered back, wiping blood from his split lip before diving back into the fray with a snarl. Rose took a step back, instinct tightening her spine. Then, just as quickly, the crowd parted like a wave as a man stepped into the chaos with a kind of authority that needed no announcement. Sheriff. Even before she saw the badge gleaming at his chest, she knew. He moved with the easy confidence of a man used to handling trouble, his broad shoulders squared beneath a worn leather duster. Call McAllister. He grabbed one of the brawlers by the collar and hauled him upright with one hand, his voice cutting through the mayhem like a blade. That's enough. The room stilled. Even the piano player hesitated over the keys. The sheriff didn't raise his voice, but something in his tone held weight, the kind that made men think twice before pushing their luck. The drunk in his grip muttered a curse, but he backed down, shoving away with a scowl. Satisfied the fight had run its course, Cole turned, and that was when his gaze locked onto hers. Rose felt the impact like a physical thing, a slow, deliberate pull deep in her chest. His eyes, dark and steady, assessed her in a single sweeping glance, lingering just long enough to make her pulse jump. She braced herself, waiting for the question, for the inevitable curiosity in his gaze. Who was she? What was she doing here alone? But he didn't ask. Instead, he tipped his hat, a barely there gesture, then turned back toward the men he'd just separated. Just like that, it was over, but the air still crackled between them, charged with something she didn't quite understand. Rose exhaled, slow and steady, then made her way to the bar. The night had just gotten a whole lot more complicated. The saloon had settled into a restless quiet. The brawl had died down, leaving only the occasional groan from a man nursing a bruised jaw and the scrape of chairs being righted. The scent of spilled whiskey lingered in the air, sharp and cloying. Rose kept her back to the bar, her fingers curled loosely around the glass of watered-down whiskey the bartender had set in front of her. She hadn't touched it. She wasn't here to drink. But neither, it seemed, was the sheriff. Cole McAllister leaned against the bar a few feet away, his presence a steady weight in the dim light. He wasn't watching her outright, but she could feel his attention, the way he tracked her with the same quiet scrutiny he'd given the brawlers minutes ago. Assessing, measuring. Finally he spoke. "Don't take you for the usual kind of woman we see in here." Rose lifted her chin just a fraction. "And what kind is that, Sheriff?" His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. The kind who drinks alone in a place like this and doesn't flinch when a fight breaks out. She didn't let her expression betray anything. "You must not pay much attention then." His dark eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Oh, I pay attention." Something in the way he said it sent a shiver along her spine, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe because it felt like he could see more than she wanted him to. That he knew what most men didn't, that she wasn't just a woman passing through town looking for work or a hot meal. She took a slow sip of her drink, using the movement to buy herself a second of composure. "Then you'll know I'm no one worth wondering about." He exhaled, slow and steady, as if weighing her words. "Funny thing about that," he murmured. "People who say they're not worth wondering about usually are." Rose's fingers tightened on the glass, but she didn't break his gaze. His voice was deep, steady, the kind that could either soothe a horse or stop a fight. She could see why a town like this had made him sheriff. He had the kind of presence that demanded respect. But respect wasn't the only thing he demanded. She saw it in the way he studied her, the way his gaze held hers with just enough challenge to make her want to look away, but not enough for her to actually do it. "So, miss," he let the word trail off, waiting for her to fill in the rest. She could lie. Should lie. But something about him about this moment made her hesitate. "O'Hara," she said finally. "Rose O'Hara." Something flickered in his eyes, just for a second, barely there. Then it was gone. He knew the name. And just like that, the air between them changed. It was subtle, but she felt it. Like the moment before a storm when the air turned thick and charged. Cole lifted his glass to his lips, but he didn't drink. "O'Hara," he repeated, almost like he was testing how it felt on his tongue. Rose forced herself to stay still, to hold his gaze. She didn't know how much he knew, or if he knew anything at all, but she couldn't afford to make a mistake. "Not now. You staying in town long?" "Not sure yet," she said smoothly. "Depends." "On what?" She gave him a slow smile. "On whether I like it here." Cole set his glass down with a quiet clink. He wasn't smiling anymore. "Guess we'll find out then," he said. Rose nodded, but the truth settled between them, heavy and unspoken. They both knew she wasn't staying, and she wasn't here by chance. The morning sun spilled over redemption, gilding the dust with a deceptive warmth that did little to ease the tension hanging in the air. The town was awake, but not just with the usual sounds of doors creaking open and horses being led to water. It was the murmurs, the sideways glances. The saloon brawl from the night before had stirred up more than broken chairs and bruised egos. Cole McAllister rode down Main Street, his shoulders squared, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He didn't have to ask what folks were whispering about. He'd been sheriff long enough to know that when trouble stirred in Redemption, his name wasn't far behind. Swore I saw her talking to the sheriff. A woman like that don't just pass through. Heard something about McAllister's past. Ain't all clean, you know. Cole's jaw tightened as he guided his horse toward the livery, pretending he didn't hear. Pretending it didn't matter. But it did. He dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post when a familiar voice called out, "Sheriff." Cole turned to see Tom Weaver, the owner of the Mercantile, stepping off his store's front porch. Older, with a slight limp from a bullet wound he'd taken in a raid years back, Tom was one of the few men in town Cole trusted. Cole nodded. "Tom." The storekeeper hesitated, glancing toward a pair of townsfolk who quickly turned away, pretending to inspect the sacks of flour outside the general store. The tension was thick enough to taste. Tom sighed, stepping closer. Heard what folks we'd been saying. Cole untied his gloves, keeping his face unreadable. "Let him talk." Tom let out a humorless chuckle. "You know Redemption. Folks here don't just talk. They listen. And they remember." He let the words hang between them before lowering his voice. "It's about the war, Cole. The past don't stay buried forever." Cole went still, his fingers clenched around the leather of his gloves, but he didn't answer right away. The war. It wasn't the first time the ghosts of it had trailed him here, and it wouldn't be the last. His silence was answer enough. Tom sighed again, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, I ain't asking for details, and I won't pretend to know what you've had to carry. But people are digging, Cole. And this woman, this Rose O'Hara, she's only adding fuel to it. Cole's gaze sharpened. He'd expected the whispers about himself, but not about her. Not yet. What about her? Tom hesitated. Some think she's got ties to your past. That she came here for a reason. A muscle ticked in Cole's jaw. He didn't like where this was going. Tom adjusted his hat, shifting his weight. I don't know who she is, and maybe you don't either. But I got a feeling she's running from something. And if I had to bet, I'd say that something's about to catch up. Cole didn't answer. Couldn't. Because for the first time in a long while he had that same feeling too. Cole sat on a weathered stump at the edge of town, his hat tilted low against the afternoon sun. The land stretched wide and unbroken before him, the horizon bleeding into endless sky. Out here, away from the watchful eyes and murmured speculation of redemption, the silence should have brought peace. It didn't. The weight of too many years settled in his bones. Tom's words still echoed in his head, stirring up things he'd long since buried. The war. The past. The choices that had followed him like a shadow he couldn't shake. He drew in a slow breath, the scent of dry earth and sun-baked grass filling his lungs. He had tried to outrun it all once. Thought if he worked hard enough, kept his head down, and forced the law, he could become something better than what he'd been. But redemption didn't forget. Neither did he. And now there was her, Rose O'Hara, a woman alone, too careful with her words, too watchful of her surroundings. He didn't believe in coincidence. She'd come to redemption for a reason. And whatever that reason was, it had just put a target on her back. A gust of wind kicked up dust, and Cole ran a hand over his face. He didn't need any more ghosts. Didn't need another reason to lose sleep at night. But he already knew he wasn't going to leave her alone. Rose sat on the narrow bed in her rented room, fingers tracing the edges of an old, yellowed letter. The air smelled faintly of lavender, though the scent was nearly masked by dust and the faint musk of aged wood. She should have burned the letter long ago. Destroyed it, just like she'd tried to destroy everything linking her to the life she'd left behind. But she couldn't. Not when it was all she had left of the truth. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the familiar lines of ink, the slant of her father's hand. The words were cold, measured. A warning wrapped in formality. You know what they are capable of, Rose. They will find you. She swallowed hard and let her gaze shift to the small, tattered photograph tucked between the folds of the letter. A faded image of a younger girl, standing beside a man in a crisp suit. The resemblance was still there, the shape of their eyes, the curve of their jawlines, but the girl in the photograph no longer existed. Rose O'Hara had died the day she left New York. The problem was, the people hunting her didn't believe that. She pressed the letter back into its envelope and slid it beneath the mattress, her heart pounding. She had come to redemption for a reason. But if she wasn't careful, redemption might become her grave. Dusk settled over redemption in a slow, creeping hush. The last light of the sun painted the sky in burnt orange and violet streaks, casting long shadows across the dirt road that ran through town. The heat of the day still clung to the air, thick and dry, but it wasn't the weather that sent a chill down Cole McAllister's spine. It was the riders. They came in slow, their horses moving at an unhurried pace, but there was something deliberate about them. 3 men, dressed in dust-streaked coats, their hats pulled low, their faces unreadable. They didn't speak as they rode past the saloon, their eyes scanning the storefronts, the people. Looking. Cole didn't move from his spot on the sheriff's porch. Didn't need to. He knew trouble when he saw it. The men stopped near the livery, dismounting in practiced movements. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, adjusted his hat and took a long look around, his gaze settling briefly on Cole before shifting away, like he didn't want to seem too interested. But Cole had seen the flicker of recognition. They weren't just passing through. A muscle tightened in Cole's jaw. He turned his head slightly, catching sight of Ben Grady leaning against a hitching post across the street. The deputy's arms were folded over his chest, his usual easy grin nowhere in sight. "You see him?" Cole asked, voice low. Ben gave the slightest nod. "Saw him. Don't like him?" Cole let his gaze drift back to the men as they handed off their horses to the stable boy. One of them murmured something, flipping the boy a coin before striding toward the saloon. He didn't like it either. Strangers coming into town wasn't unusual. Redemption was a stop on the way west, a place for drifters and traders alike. But these men weren't just passing through. They were hunting. And Cole had a damn good idea who they were looking for. He exhaled slowly, his fingers flexing at his sides. "Keep an eye on him," he murmured to Ben. "I want to know who they talk to, where they go." Ben hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then he nodded. Got it. Cole didn't miss the pause. Something about it didn't sit right. But now wasn't the time to question it. Now was the time to prepare. Because trouble had come to Redemption, and it wasn't leaving quietly. The night had settled thick over Redemption, the moon casting long silvered shadows against the wooden buildings. The saloon was alive with laughter and clinking glasses, but in the narrow alley behind it, silence reigned. Ben Grady stood with his back against the weathered wall, his pulse beating hard against his throat. He shouldn't be here. Shouldn't be listening to the low, measured voice of the man standing just inside the shadows, speaking words that stuck like barbs in his conscience. "You sure he don't suspect you?" the man asked. Ben swallowed hard, his boots scuffing against the dirt. He knew better than to look directly at the stranger. He'd learned early that men like him, men who thrived in secrets and shadows, didn't like being watched too closely. "Cole don't suspect a thing," Ben muttered. "Not yet." The man chuckled, the sound as smooth as aged whiskey but twice as dangerous. "Good. Let's keep it that way." He took a slow step forward, just enough for the lamplight from the street to catch the harsh planes of his face. The scar running down his jaw twisted when he smirked. Ben forced himself to hold still. Forced himself to remember why he was doing this. "He's getting too close," the man continued. "That woman Rose, she's more than she's letting on. And if Cole figures that out before we do, well," he let the words dangle, the unspoken threat curling between them like smoke. Ben licked his lips, his stomach knotted. "I don't like this." The man sighed, shaking his head like a father might at a foolish son. "Doesn't much matter what you like, deputy. We all got choices. You made yours when you took that money." Ben stiffened. He hated being reminded of that, of the moment he'd let desperation outweigh his better judgment. At the time, it had seemed easy. A little information, a little looking the other way. No one had to get hurt. Now it felt like a noose tightening around his neck. "You just keep your eyes open," the man said, his voice turning to gravel. "And when the time comes, you best remember which side you're on." Ben's throat worked as he nodded once. Then, without another word, the man melted back into the darkness, his presence leaving behind a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Ben let out a shaky breath and pressed his hand against the wall to steady himself. Cole trusted him. The town trusted him. But trust wouldn't save him when the truth came out. The night was thick with the scent of sage and damp earth, a cool wind sweeping through the open window of the sheriff's office. Cole sat at his desk, absently thumbing through a stack of paperwork, but his mind was elsewhere. Something gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't shake. Ben had been acting strange. Not obvious to anyone who didn't know him well, but Cole did. The hesitation in his voice, the flicker of unease in his eyes, it had been enough to plant a seed of doubt. And doubt had a way of taking root. His gaze drifted to the pile of dispatches from neighboring towns. Petty crimes, a few stolen horses, a fight that had gotten out of hand in Santa Fe. Nothing unusual. But when he shifted the papers, something beneath them caught his eye. A torn slip of paper. Cole frowned, picking it up. The writing was hastily scrawled, the ink slightly smudged. Midnight. behind the old livery. Keep it quiet. A chill slithered down his spine. His gut told him this wasn't nothing. He rose, crossing the room in a few strides. The office safe sat against the back wall, its lock sturdy, but the door wasn't fully latched. Cole's pulse quickened. He pulled it open and rifled through the contents: his personal files, arrest warrants, payroll records. One of the folders was out of place. He yanked it out and flipped it open. The papers inside were legal documents, town records, but more importantly, reports on a string of stolen cattle from a ranch outside Redemption, cattle that had gone missing about the same time as those men had ridden into town. Someone had been looking at these, someone who shouldn't have been. His stomach turned to lead. Ben. Cole didn't want to believe it. The kid had been his deputy for years, stood by him through some rough patches. But trust was a fragile thing. And in this world, even the best of men had their price. Memories flickered unbidden: Ben laughing over a drink at the saloon, riding beside him on long patrols, standing shoulder in a gunfight that could have ended them both. Had it all been a lie? Cole clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the note. He'd seen enough men sell their souls for less than what someone might have offered Ben, but he had to be sure. Shoving the note into his coat pocket, he grabbed his gun belt and strapped it on. If Ben was meeting someone behind the livery at midnight, Cole damn well planned to be there too. The sheriff's office was quiet, too quiet. The lamp on Cole's desk cast long shadows against the walls, flickering with each slow breath he took. The weight of what he'd seen behind the livery sat heavy in his gut. Ben Grady stood across from him, hands braced on the back of a chair, his posture just relaxed enough to be an act. He wasn't dumb. He knew something was coming. Cole leaned back against the desk, arms crossed over his chest, jaw tight. You want to tell me why you were sneaking around behind the livery at midnight? Ben blinked. What? Cole didn't move, didn't flinch. You heard me. Ben huffed a laugh, shaking his head. Hell, Cole. You got me under watch now. Can't a man take a damn walk? Cole let the silence stretch between them, watching, listening. The way Ben's fingers gripped the chair a little tighter. The way his eyes flicked toward the door, not enough to run, but enough to measure the distance. A tell. Cole straightened, pulling a small scrap of paper from his pocket. The note, the meeting time, the location. He held it up between two fingers, letting the flickering lamplight catch the ink. You're gonna look me in the eye and tell me this ain't yours? Ben's throat bobbed. Where'd you get that? Does it matter? Cole's voice was steel now, low and edged. What matters is who you were meeting and why. Ben scoffed, but it was weak. You think I'm working against you? Against Redemption? Cole took a step forward, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. I don't think, Ben. I know. The room went still. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The wind rattled the window pane, but Cole's attention never wavered. He saw the shift in Ben's eyes, the flicker of guilt, the hesitation. Then, there it was, the mistake. Ben opened his mouth, then shut it just as fast. Looked away, just for a second. Cole clenched his jaw. Damn it, Ben. The deputy exhaled sharply, shaking his head. It ain't what you think. No. Cole's voice was rough now, laced with something dangerously close to hurt. Then you best start talking. Ben scrubbed a hand over his face, his shoulders sagging. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I swear it, Cole. Cole's gut twisted. That was the truth. But it didn't make the betrayal any easier. Ben dragged in a breath. They said it was just information. Just keeping an eye on things. I thought he cut himself off, voice raw. I thought I could keep it under control. Cole stared at him, heart hammering. Who? Ben hesitated. I can't. Cole's hand shot out, gripping Ben's shirt front, dragging him forward. You don't get to pick and choose now, Grady. Who the hell are you working for? Ben swallowed, eyes darting away again. And Cole knew that whoever these men were, whatever they wanted, it wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about Redemption. It was about Rose. His grip tightened before he let Ben go, stepping back like the weight of it all was pressing too hard against his chest. Ben rubbed a hand over his jaw, shame thick in his expression. "I never meant to hurt you." Cole's voice was low, almost quiet. "You already did. And the worst part, it wasn't over yet." The knock came just after sundown, sharp and deliberate. Rose stiffened, setting down the brush she'd been running through her hair. No one in Redemption had reason to call on her. Not at this hour. Not unless she crossed the small rented room and cracked open the door. A man stood on the porch, tall and poised, his presence as out of place as a polished boot in a cattle pen. His suit was crisp, the deep charcoal fabric untouched by dust or travel, and his gloves were fine leather, the kind meant for show, not work. His eyes, sharp and assessing, met hers without hesitation. "Miss O'Hara," he said smoothly. Rose's fingers tightened on the doorknob. "Who's asking?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope. The wax emblem, stamped deep into the paper, sent a cold wave through her. She knew that seal, knew who had sent it. She didn't move to take it. The man's lips pressed into a thin smile. "I was instructed to deliver this personally." Rose forced her expression to stay neutral, though her pulse roared in her ears. She took the letter, her fingers brushing against the paper's crisp edges. The messenger dipped his head in a polite nod. "Good evening, Miss O'Hara." Then he turned, descending the steps with the same unhurried grace he'd arrived with. Rose closed the door with care, the weight of the letter heavier than it should have been. She crossed to the oil lamp on the bedside table, the soft glow casting long shadows across the room. Sitting on the edge of the mattress, she turned the envelope over in her hands. She hadn't seen that seal in years, had hoped she never would again. Her breath came slow and measured as she slipped her nail under the wax, breaking it with a quiet snap. The letter unfolded, the paper smooth, untouched by time. She scanned the words, the formal script sharp and clear. "You are being watched," her grip tightened. "Return at once. This charade has gone on long enough. You belong to the East, not the West." A bitter taste filled her mouth. There was no signature. None was needed. Her father's voice was in every cold syllable. She stared at the page, her heart hammering. She'd known the past would catch up to her eventually. She just hadn't expected it to find her so soon. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Rose stood at the edge of town, her arms wrapped around herself against the cool desert air. The stars overhead stretched wide and endless, a sharp contrast to the walls closing in around her. She heard Cole's approach before she saw him. The steady crunch of boots on dry earth, the sure, measured steps of a man who didn't rattle easy. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze unreadable in the dim light. "You said you needed to talk." Rose swallowed hard, nodding. She had spent the last day convincing herself this was the right thing to do. But now that the moment was here, the words felt heavy, too heavy. Cole watched her waiting, patient, but not unseeing. She took a breath. "I haven't been honest with you." His jaw tightened just slightly. "I figured." That stung more than it should have, but she couldn't blame him. She had been hiding, dodging questions, staying just enough in the shadows to avoid real scrutiny. She forced herself to meet his eyes. "My name isn't just Rose O'Hara. My full name is Rosalind Kensington O'Hara." She let the name settle, searching for any sign of recognition. His brow furrowed slightly, but he stayed silent. "My father is Charles Kensington," she continued, the words tasting bitter. "You probably don't know the name, but back east, it means something. He's one of the most powerful businessmen in New York." Cole absorbed that, his gaze never leaving hers. "And you ran from that?" Rose exhaled sharply. "I didn't have a choice." She reached into her coat pocket, pulling out the letter she had read the night before. She hesitated, then handed it to him. Cole took it, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment. He unfolded the paper, scanning the precise script. His jaw clenched as he read. When he finished, he folded the letter back carefully. "What does he want from you?" She let out a bitter laugh. "To control me. Like he always has." She looked away, her throat tightening. "I have something." Information he doesn't want getting out. It's proof of backroom deals, land grabs, corruption that ties him to powerful men on both sides of the country. Cole didn't react immediately, but the shift in his stance told her he understood the weight of what she was saying. "You're telling me the men who rode into town are here because of this?" She nodded. "They won't stop. My father doesn't leave loose ends." The silence stretched between them, thick with things unsaid. Finally, Cole sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Damn it, Rose," she stiffened. "If you don't want to be caught up in this, I understand." He shot her a sharp look. "That's not what I meant." He took a step closer, his voice lower now, rough but steady. "You should have told me sooner." She dropped her gaze, her voice quieter. "Would you have believed me?" Cole didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his tone was gentler. "Yeah, I would have." Her throat tightened. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't facing this alone. Cole sighed, shifting his weight. "You got a plan." She let out a breath, her lips curving faintly. "I was hoping you'd help me come up with one." He shook his head, but there was something softer in his expression now. Something that looked dangerously close to trust. "All right," he said. "We'll figure it out." For the first time in years, Rose felt a sliver of hope. Act 2. Cole was at his desk when the knock came. Firm, measured, not the kind that belonged to a man looking for trouble, but not friendly either. He set down his coffee, the weight in his gut tightening. "Come in." The door creaked open, and a man stepped inside. The years had changed him, but not enough for Cole to forget. Wyatt Morgan. Cole leaned back in his chair, studying the man with a steady gaze. Wyatt had been a gunslinger once, the kind of man who walked the thin line between law and outlaw. Now he looked older, leaner. His coat was dust-covered, his face lined with hard living, but his eyes hadn't lost that sharp edge. "Well, hell," Wyatt said, taking off his hat. "Didn't think I'd ever see you sit in behind a sheriff's desk." Cole didn't smile. "Didn't think I'd see you walking through my door." Wyatt let out a short chuckle, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Yeah, well, funny how time works." He pulled out a chair without being invited and sat, stretching his legs. "I heard you were still breathing. Figured I ought to come see for myself." Cole crossed his arms. "You didn't ride all the way here just to catch up." Wyatt's smile faded. He drummed his fingers on the armrest, glancing around the office like he was weighing his next words. "You got men sniffing around town," he said finally. "Men who don't belong." Cole's jaw tightened. "I noticed." Wyatt exhaled, shaking his head. "You got bigger problems than you think, McAllister." He leaned forward, voice lower now. "There's a name that keeps popping up when folks talk about you. A name I haven't heard in years." Cole already knew what was coming. "You're a ghost, Cole," Wyatt murmured. "But so is he." The room went cold. Wyatt didn't need to say the name. It hung between them like smoke. Nathan. Cole's fingers curled into fists against his thighs. His brother had been dead to him for years. And now, just like that, he wasn't. "Whatever you think you know, forget it," Cole said, his voice flat. Wyatt shook his head. "Wish I could." Cole stood abruptly, crossing the room to the window. The town outside went on, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Nathan was alive. And if Wyatt had come all this way to say so, then it meant his brother wasn't just living, he was moving. Cole's throat felt tight, the past pressing in on him like a storm rolling over the plains. He had spent years burying that part of his life. But the past didn't stay buried. Not when blood was involved. Cole stood at the window long after Wyatt had left, watching the town move through the quiet rhythm of evening. Shopkeepers locking their doors, ranch hands ambling toward the saloon, lanterns flickering to life against the deepening dusk. It all looked the same, but nothing felt the same. Nathan. The name sat heavy in his chest, a wound that had never fully healed. He turned from the window and reached for the whiskey bottle on the shelf. Pouring himself a drink, he stared at the amber liquid a moment before taking a slow sip. It burned, but not enough to dull the thoughts racing through his head. Wyatt wouldn't have come if he wasn't sure. which meant his blood was tangled up in whatever was happening. The stolen cattle, the men who had ridden into town, Rose's past catching up to her. And now this. The weight of it settled over him, heavier than his badge. Nathan had always walked a dangerous line, even as a boy. Too reckless, too eager to chase the next thrill, the next opportunity. Cole had spent his whole life trying to keep him from falling too far, but he'd failed. When the war ended, so had the last of Cole's hope for his brother. Now, after all these years, Nathan wasn't just alive, he was here. And if he was mixed up in whatever was coming for Rose, Cole would have to make a choice. Duty or blood. He drained the rest of his whiskey and set the glass down with more force than necessary. The choice should have been simple. But as he stared into the darkened streets of redemption, his reflection in the glass showing the hard lines of a man carrying too much, he knew the truth. Nothing about this was simple, and it never would be. The air was thick with dust and tension. Twilight stretched long shadows across the dry earth, turning the outskirts of redemption into a battleground waiting for the first shot. Cole stood at the edge of town, his rifle resting easy in his grip, though there was nothing easy about what was coming. A few yards away, Rose checked the cylinder of a small revolver, her jaw tight. "You still got time to change your mind," Cole said, watching her. She snapped the chamber shut with a sharp click. "Not a chance." His mouth tightened, but he didn't argue. There was no time for that now. Beyond them, just visible through the thinning dusk, figures moved on horseback, gathering near the ridge. More than Cole had expected. More than they could take on their own. But they weren't alone. Behind them, a handful of townsfolk had taken their place as men with shotguns and pistols, ranchers and shopkeepers who'd lived hard lives and weren't afraid to fight for what was theirs. Cole turned to them, his voice calm and sure. "They want to take this town, take her, and take whatever else they think they're owed. But we ain't letting that happen." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, some men nodding, others simply gripping their weapons tighter. A gust of wind kicked up, sending dust swirling between them and the advancing riders. Then, through the haze, Cole saw him. Nathan. His brother sat tall in the saddle, hat low, his silhouette familiar in a way that turned Cole's gut. But the man he'd grown up with wasn't the one sitting on that horse. This version of Nathan rode with killers. Their eyes met across the distance. Cole's grip tightened on his rifle. This wasn't just about redemption anymore. This was personal. Nathan lifted a hand, signaling his men forward. The time for talk was over. Cole squared his shoulders, his voice low but firm. "Get ready." Beside him, Rose steadied her grip, her green eyes dark with determination. Then the first shot rang out, and the battle for redemption began. Gunfire cracked through the night, drowning out the shouts of men and the pounding of hooves against dry earth. Smoke thickened in the air, the scent of gunpowder mixing with dust and sweat. Cole fired off a shot, taking down a man who had tried to slip past him. His heart pounded steady, his focus sharp. Years of war had trained him to survive, but this fight was different. This wasn't just a battle for redemption, this was a reckoning. Through the haze, a familiar figure moved toward him, slow and deliberate. Nathan. His brother stood just a few feet away, his pistol drawn but not yet raised. The years had changed him, his face leaner, his expression hardened, but the smirk was the same. "Been a long time," Nathan said, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. Cole's jaw tightened. "Not long enough." Nathan chuckled, rolling his shoulders like this was any other night. "Still good with a gun, I see. You still run with the wrong kind of men." Nathan shrugged. "Men who pay." Cole exhaled sharply. "That what this is? Money." Nathan's eyes flickered, but his smirk stayed. "A man's gotta survive, brother." Cole shook his head, anger curling in his gut. "Survive?" He gestured around them. "You brought hell to this town, Nathan. And for what?" "A few bags of gold." Nathan's smirk faltered. "It ain't that simple. It never is with you." The sound of more gunfire split the air, and from the corner of his eye, Cole caught a glimpse of Rose, moving fast as she ducked behind a wagon. She fired off a shot, striking a man trying to make a grab for her. She had the evidence in her satchel, the papers that could bring down some of the most powerful men in the East, and the mercenaries knew it. Nathan followed Cole's gaze, his smirk turning grim. "That's what this is about, ain't it?" The girl. Cole's grip tightened on his gun. "This is about a lot of things." Nathan scoffed, but there was something in his eyes, something bitter. "You always did think you were better than me." "No," Cole said, his voice steady. "I just never stopped caring about right and wrong." For the first time, doubt flickered in Nathan's gaze. It was brief, but Cole saw it. A sharp cry rang out and both men turned. Rose had been cornered. A man reached for her, yanking at her satchel. She fought back, but she was outnumbered. Cole didn't think, he moved. Nathan moved too. The moment stretched, suspended between past and present, between betrayal and blood. Then Nathan lifted his gun and shot the man reaching for Rose. Silence. Cole stared, his breath coming fast. Nathan exhaled and shook his head. Damn it. Then he looked at Cole, something unreadable in his eyes. "Get her out to here." Cole didn't hesitate. He turned, grabbed Rose's arm and ran. Behind him, Nathan raised his gun again. But this time he wasn't aiming at his brother. He was covering his back, and Cole had no idea if that meant anything at all. The smoke had begun to clear, but the scent of blood and gunpowder still clung to the air. Cole stood in the middle of what had been Redemption's main street, his boots planted in dirt still damp with the fight's remains. The bodies had been taken away, the worst of the wounded tended to, but the scars, the kind that ran deeper than flesh, would take longer to fade. He rolled his shoulders, exhaustion weighing heavy, but there was no time to rest. Townsfolk moved around him, picking up what pieces they could. Chairs from the saloon, splintered from men being thrown through them, were being hauled into a pile. The window at the Mercantile had been shot clean through, and old Tom Weaver stood beside it, running a hand through his thinning grey hair as he muttered about needing new glass. A few women patched up wounded men in the shade of the livery, their hushed voices filled with quiet worry. Life had a way of pressing forward even after a night like this. Cole let out a breath and turned, his gaze landing on Ben Grady sitting on the steps of the sheriff's office. The deputy's face was bruised, his lip split. He looked up when he felt Cole's eyes on him, but he didn't say anything. Didn't have to. The trust between them had cracked, maybe beyond fixing. But Ben had stayed. Fought. That had to count for something. Cole gave him a short nod. Not forgiveness, not yet. But something close. Ben swallowed hard and nodded back. Across the street, Rose stood near the saloon, her arms wrapped around herself as she watched the town rebuild. The evidence she had risked her life for was safe now, but the fight had cost her too. Cole walked over, stopping just beside her. She didn't look at him right away. "I keep thinking about the ones who didn't make it." Her voice was quiet. He followed her gaze, taking in the town, the patches of blood on the ground, the broken doors and shattered glass, the silent spaces where men should have been standing. "They'll be remembered," he said. She exhaled. "I hope so." The silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable, just waited. Finally, she looked up at him, something hesitant in her eyes. "Nathan." Cole's throat tightened. His brother had vanished before the dust had settled, leaving nothing behind but more unanswered questions. "I don't know," he admitted. Rose nodded, understanding what he couldn't put into words. A gust of wind carried the scent of earth and rain, a promise that the storm had passed. Cole looked down at Rose, at the woman who had turned his world upside down, and felt something shift inside him. Maybe it wasn't about forgetting the past. Maybe it was about moving forward despite it. The sheriff's office was quiet, the kind of silence that weighed heavy. A single oil lamp flickered on the desk, casting long shadows against the wooden walls. The town outside was rebuilding, but in this room, things were breaking. Cole leaned against the edge of the desk, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Across from him, Ben Grady sat slumped in a chair, his bruised face half hidden in shadow. His hands were clasped between his knees, shoulders hunched like a man carrying too much. Cole tossed a folded piece of paper onto the desk. "Found this in your bunk." Ben didn't move. He didn't need to. He already knew what it said. Cole's voice was even, steady. "You were feeding him information." Ben let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening. "Yeah, no excuses, no lies." Cole waited, but Ben didn't say anything else. "You want to tell me why?" Cole pressed. Ben's jaw clenched. At first it was just money, he admitted, voice rough. Didn't seem like a big deal. They just wanted to know things who was passing through, who had power in town. I thought I could control it." He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "But I was wrong." Cole's stomach twisted. He had spent years trusting Ben, riding side by side with him, calling him a friend. The betrayal cut deep. "You put this town at risk," Cole said, his voice tight. "People are dead because of you." Ben flinched. "You think I don't know that?" He looked up then, his blue eyes raw. "I never meant for it to go this far, Cole." Cole studied him. The regret was real, but regret didn't change what had happened. "You had a choice," Cole said, "and you made the wrong one." Ben exhaled sharply, leaning back in the chair. "Yeah," he swallowed hard, his gaze dropping. "So what happens now?" Cole let the silence stretch. If this were any other man, any other crime, Cole would know what to do. But this was Ben, his friend, his deputy. Cole ran a hand over his jaw, then straightened. "You leave," he said finally. "Tonight." Ben blinked, surprised. "That's it. If I see you in Redemption again, I'll put you in a cell. And if the wrong man finds out what you did, you won't live to see a trial." Ben's throat worked. He knew it was true. Slowly he stood, looking around the office like he was memorizing it. "I never wanted to be your enemy, Cole." Cole held his gaze. "Then you shouldn't have been." Ben gave a slow nod. No argument, no defense. He turned and walked to the door, pausing just long enough to say, "I'm sorry." Then he was gone. Cole stood in the empty room, listening to the echo of footsteps fading into the night. The town was safe. Order had been restored. But at what cost? He didn't have an answer. All he knew was that Redemption still had work to do. And so did he. The hammering started early. Cole stood in the middle of Redemption's main street, watching as townsfolk worked to rebuild what had been broken. The saloon's shattered windows had been replaced with fresh glass, the mercantile's door reinforced with new hinges. Men patched bullet holes in the livery's walls, while women swept debris from boardwalks, their voices carrying in soft conversation. It wasn't just buildings being mended. Redemption had been shaken, but it hadn't fallen. Cole adjusted his hat, rolling his shoulders as he moved toward the sheriff's office. He hadn't slept much, but he wasn't the only one. The whole town had been running on something other than rest determination, maybe. A need to move forward. Across the street, Rose was talking with a few women outside the general store. She had dirt on her skirts, a smudge of paint on her wrist, and something in her expression that he hadn't seen before. She looked like she belonged. She caught him watching and tilted her head. "Something on my face, Sheriff?" He almost smiled. "Just paint." She glanced at her wrist, then wiped it absently on her skirt. "Better." "Not really." This time she did smile. Cole stepped closer, his voice quieter. "How you holding up?" Her gaze flickered, but she didn't look away. "I've been running for a long time," she admitted. "Feels strange to stop." He nodded, understanding that more than he wanted to. "Think you'll stay?" She glanced around the town, the people working. The sun shining against freshly nailed boards, the way life kept pressing forward. "I think I might." Cole felt something ease in his chest. Before he could say anything else, a few men from the town council approached, nodding in greeting. "We've been talking," one of them said. "Figured now's as good a time as any to meet about how we move forward." Cole exhaled, glancing at Rose before turning back to them. "Let's get to it then, because Redemption wasn't just rebuilding, it was healing." and so were they. The fire crackled low, sending sparks drifting into the night. The scent of burning wood mixed with the cool desert air, settling over them in a way that felt both familiar and new. Cole stretched his legs out, leaning back against a log as he watched the flames dance. Rose sat across from him, her knees drawn up, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. For a while, neither of them spoke. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, just the kind that came when two people had been through too much to need words. Rose finally glanced up, her green eyes catching the firelight. "Did you ever think this is where you'd end up?" Cole huffed a quiet laugh. "Not once." She tilted her head. "What did you think you'd be?" He thought about that for a moment, staring into the fire. A soldier, probably. Or dead. She didn't flinch, didn't try to soften the truth. And now? He looked at her then. "Now, I don't know, but for the first time, that don't bother me." She smiled, just a little. "Me neither." Cole set his coffee aside, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You still thinking about leaving?" She hesitated. "I was." His stomach tightened, but he waited. "But something's different now," she continued, watching the embers glow. "I spent so long looking over my shoulder, expecting the past to catch up. And when it did, I realized I didn't have to run anymore." Cole studied her, reading more in her expression than she probably meant to show. "You ain't got to decide right now." She reached out then, her fingers brushing his where they rested on his knee. Just a touch, barely there. But it said everything. "I already did," she murmured. Cole felt something settle deep in his chest. A warmth, quiet but steady. He turned his hand over, letting their fingers lace together. The past still lingered, but it wasn't in control anymore. Not for either of them. The fire burned low, the night stretching quiet around them. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something worth holding on to. The first light of dawn stretched across the sky, painting redemption in soft golds and pinks. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh earth and morning dew, a stark contrast to the smoke and blood that had once stained these streets. Cole stepped onto the wooden boardwalk, his boots steady against the worn planks. The town was stirring, slow but determined, its people shaking off the weight of the past weeks. A new day, a new start. Beside him, Rose matched his pace, her head high, her expression set with quiet confidence. She was different now, stronger, steadier, but so was he. The townsfolk nodded as they passed, tipping hats, offering small smiles. A month ago, there had been wariness in those glances. Now there was something else. Trust. Old Tom Weaver stood outside the mercantile, arms crossed over his chest. "Sheriff," he greeted. Cole tipped his hat. "Morning, Tom." The older man's gaze slid to Rose, a knowing glint in his eye. "Miss O'Hara," she smiled. "Tom." He nodded approvingly before turning back to his shop, the moment simple, but saying plenty. A few doors down, Ben Grady's old badge rested on Cole's desk inside the sheriff's office. It would stay there until he found the right man to wear it. The town needed law, but it needed the right kind of law. Ian Rose stopped at the edge of town, looking out over the horizon, where the sun crested the distant hills. "So," Cole said after a moment, "you stayin'?" Rose exhaled, her fingers curling around his. "I think I already answered that." He squeezed her hand, his lips tilting just slightly. Behind them, redemption moved forward, boards nailed, walls painted, lives rebuilt. Ahead of them, the open road stretched long and wide, but for the first time, neither of them felt the pull to run. They had found what they needed. Right here, Cole sat on the ridge, overlooking redemption, the same spot he used to come to when the weight of his past pressed too hard. The land stretched wide before him, the town small but strong, its people moving about their morning like they always had. Only now there was something different, a sense of renewal. The town had been through hell, but it had survived. So had he. So had Rose. The wind carried the scent of sage and fresh earth, the air cool against his skin. He used to sit here and wonder if he'd ever outrun the things he'd done, the ghosts that followed him. But looking down at redemption now, he realized he hadn't needed to outrun anything. He'd just needed to face it. Footsteps sounded behind him. He didn't have to turn to know it was Rose. She settled beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "Figured I'd find you up here." He glanced at her, the golden morning light catching in her auburn hair. "He didn't know I was lost," she smirked. "Didn't say you were." They sat in silence for a while, watching the town come to life below. A rancher led his horses toward the river. Tom Weaver hauled a new barrel onto the mercantile's porch. The blacksmith stoked his forge, the clang of metal ringing faintly through the air. Life went on. Rose exhaled, tucking her knees to her chest. "It's strange, isn't it?" Cole tilted his head. "What is?" She glanced at him. "Not running." He studied her, then reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Yeah," he admitted, "but I think I could get used to it." She smiled, small but certain, then rested her head against his shoulder. Cole looked out over the land again, the place that had once been just another town, another stop along the road. Now it was home. And for the first time, the past didn't feel like something to escape. It felt like something he could leave behind. Down in the town, the people of redemption kept moving forward. So would he. So would they.